Operation Hailstone was way worse than you think. Before dawn, on February 17th, 1944, the waters of Truk Lagoon were calm. Too calm. Beneath the surface, Japanese ships lay at anchor, steel giants resting behind coral walls, protected by distance, by geography, and by belief. For years, this place had been called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. It was supposed to be untouchable. 36 hours later, it was a graveyard. When the sun set on the second day, the lagoon was choked with burning oil and shattered hulls. Wrecked aircraft floated wingtip to wingtip. Tankers smoldered like funeral pyres, their fuel turning turquoise water into sheets of fire. The smoke rose so thick it swallowed the sky. In less than 2 days, Japan lost cruisers, destroyers, and more than 40 transport and tanker ships. Hundreds of aircraft vanished. Some shot down in flames, others destroyed before their pilots ever reached the cockpit. Nearly 200,000 tons of supplies meant to feed and arm Japan's Pacific Empire slipped silently to the bottom. This was not a battle for territory. This was an execution of a fortress. Operation Hailstone erased Japan's most powerful naval base without a single American soldier setting foot on its beaches. No desperate amphibious assault. No grinding siege. Just speed, intelligence, and overwhelming force, applied with brutal precision. And when it was over, there was nothing left to invade. But how did a base once compared to Pearl Harbor fall in a single weekend? How did confidence turn into catastrophe so completely? To understand that, we have to go back to a time when Truk Lagoon believed itself immortal. The fortress that felt invincible, Truk Lagoon, now called Truk, sits in the Caroline Islands like a natural fortress carved by ancient volcanoes and shaped by the patient work of coral over thousands of years. A nearly impenetrable ring of coral reefs surrounds the lagoon, with only a few narrow entrances wide enough for warships to pass through. Inside, calm waters stretch across dozens of square miles, deep enough to anchor battleships and carriers, sheltered enough to make storms feel like gentle breezes from the outside world. It was a gift from nature to any navy lucky enough to claim it. By the early 1940s, the Imperial Japanese Navy had done exactly that. On the islands scattered throughout the lagoon, Dublon, Eton, Moen, Param, Japan built multiple airfields, seaplane bases, coastal gun batteries, and dense anti-aircraft defenses. Fuel depots held thousands of tons of oil and aviation gasoline. Ammunition bunkers were dug deep into the hillsides. Repair facilities could service everything from small patrol boats to heavy cruisers. Truk wasn't just a harbor. It was a complete naval infrastructure, a city built for war. Officers walking along the docks might have watched transport ships unload crates of supplies, their cranes swinging back and forth in the humid air. Fighter planes taxied along runways carved out of jungle, their engines roaring as pilots prepared for patrol flights. Sailors stood on the decks of destroyers, looking out at the ring of coral that surrounded them like a protective wall. Everything about Truk whispered safety, security, distance from the enemy. And why wouldn't it? The lagoon commanded the vital supply routes running from Japan down to Southeast Asia and the resource-rich southern regions. Every tanker carrying oil from the Dutch East Indies, every transport hauling troops to New Guinea, every warship heading south to confront the Allies. They all passed through or refueled at Truk. Lose Truk, and Japan's entire Pacific logistics network would collapse like a house of cards in a typhoon. Standing on the deck of a destroyer anchored in the lagoon, a Japanese naval officer might have gazed across the water at the other ships bobbing gently at their moorings. Perhaps he thought to himself, even if the Americans wanted to attack us here, they would never make it through. Our radar watches the skies, our fighters patrol the approaches, and the coral reefs guard us better than any minefield ever could. It was a comforting thought. It was also dead wrong. By late 1943, The war was no longer going Japan's way. The tide had turned, and the fortress that once felt invincible was about to become a trap. The trap begins to close. From the southwest, General Douglas MacArthur's combined US-Australian forces had been clawing their way up through New Guinea under Operation Cartwheel. One by one, major Japanese bases fell or were isolated. Rabaul, once a powerful stronghold, was surrounded and cut off, its garrison left to wither without supplies. Key island groups across the South Pacific were neutralized. The southern approaches to Truk, which had once been secure highways for Japanese shipping, were no longer safe. At the same time, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz's Pacific Fleet launched assaults on the Gilbert and Marshall Islands to the east. American Marines stormed ashore at Tarawa in November 1943, fighting one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War to seize a tiny atoll that would become a stepping stone toward Japan. By early 1944, the Americans were building forward air bases in the Marshall Islands, only a few hundred nautical miles east of Truk, close enough for reconnaissance aircraft to photograph the lagoon, close enough for carrier strikes to reach it. Truk was being surrounded. The supply lines that ran through it were being cut, one by one, like arteries severed in a surgical strike. Japanese commanders could feel the noose tightening. Sensing the danger, Admiral Minechi Koga, commander of the combined fleet, made a decision. In October 1943, he secretly moved most of the fleet, the pride of the Imperial Navy, carriers, battleships, heavy cruisers, to Palau and later to Indonesia. The move was done under cover of darkness, without fanfare, without announcement. One night the lagoon was full of warships, their silhouettes dark against the moonlit water. The next morning they were gone, leaving Truk's anchorage suddenly emptier than it had been in years. But not everything left. In early February 1944, U.S. reconnaissance aircraft, PB-4Y Liberators flying dangerously close to Japanese airspace, spotted several major warships still anchored at Truk. Among them, the mighty battleship Musashi, one of the largest and most powerful warships ever built, and the fleet carriers Zuikaku and Chiyoda, veterans of many battles. The photographs were rushed back to American commanders. Alarm bells rang. If those ships were still there, they were vulnerable. Admiral Koga, realizing his mistake, rushed to evacuate the remaining capital ships. They slipped out of Truk just in time, disappearing into the vastness of the Pacific before the Americans could strike. But dozens of transport ships, tankers, supply vessels, and smaller warships remained inside the lagoon, along with hundreds of aircraft parked on the airfields and thousands of tons of fuel and ammunition stored in depots. The Americans saw a target rich with possibilities, a logistics hub brimming with everything Japan needed to sustain its war effort across the Pacific. And they saw weakness, no heavy warships to defend it, no fleet carriers to launch counterstrikes, just cargo ships, fuel, and planes, sitting ducks waiting to be slaughtered. Here's the first lesson history teaches us. Half measures in war are often worse than doing nothing. By evacuating only the most valuable ships, Japan left Truk looking like a tempting target, full of supplies and aircraft, but without the naval power to defend itself. The Americans saw the opportunity and pounced. Sometimes in war, it's better to commit fully to defense or abandon a position entirely. Doing something in between just invites disaster. The trap was set. Now the United States Navy was about to spring it with overwhelming force. The hailstorm unleashed. Dawn, February 17, 1944. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher under the overall direction of Admiral Raymond Spruance, was a floating armada of destruction. 5 fleet carriers, Enterprise, Yorktown, Essex, Intrepid, and Bunker Hill, plus 4 light carriers fielded more than 500 aircraft. Escorting them were battleships with guns that could hurl shells the size of small cars, cruisers bristling with anti-aircraft batteries, and destroyers slicing through the waves like hungry sharks. It was a steel wall that could obliterate anything in its path. On February 12, 1944, the fleet had set sail from Majuro Atoll in the Marshall Islands, heading west toward Truk. 5 days of radio silence, 5 days of sailing through empty ocean under tropical skies, the sailors wondering where they were going, what they would face. 5 days for Japanese radar operators to scan the skies and see nothing. At dawn on February 17, 1944, the U.S. fleet quietly moved into position about 90 nautical miles northeast of Truk. At 0500 hours, while the sky was still dark and stars still hung in the heavens, the aircraft carriers launched their first strike. The roar of engines tore through the early morning stillness as hundreds of American planes took off, one after another, their propellers cutting through the humid air. They slipped in under low cloud cover, hugging the waves to avoid detection, flying toward their targets with the sun rising behind them. At that moment, there were no Japanese patrol planes in the air. Many pilots from Truk's 22nd and 26th Air Groups were on leave on the mainland, enjoying a brief respite from the war. The airfields were short of ready crews. Even those who remained were unprepared for what was about to happen. Worse still, Truk's radar system had a fatal flaw. It could not detect low-flying aircraft. The American planes hugging the ocean's surface were invisible to the very technology Japan relied on for warning. The radar operators, staring at their screens that morning, perhaps saw nothing unusual. Maybe one of them yawned, stretched, and thought to himself, "Just another quiet morning. Nothing ever happens here." All these factors combined to give the Americans total strategic surprise. Their first strike came out of nowhere, like a thunderclap on a clear day. Around 6:30 a.m., air raid sirens wailed across the islands, their shrill cry shattering the morning calm. American aircraft swarmed into Truk's skies like a swarm of hornets, their engines filling the air with a deafening roar. Japanese pilots scrambled to their planes, desperately trying to take off and fight back. Mechanics ran across the tarmac, shouting instructions. Anti-aircraft crews swung their guns towards the sky, searching for targets. Though Japan had more than 300 aircraft stationed at Truk, only about half managed to get airborne before the Americans struck. And those that did were quickly thrown into a hopeless dogfight. The once feared Mitsubishi 6M0 fighters, symbols of early Japanese air supremacy that had dominated the skies over Pearl Harbor and the Philippines, were now badly outclassed. The American F-6F Hellcats had superior speed, firepower, heavier armor, and, most importantly, better trained pilots. With the advantage of surprise, the Hellcats swept the Japanese from the sky like a broom clearing dust from a floor. One American pilot, diving through the chaos with his finger on the trigger, might have called out over the radio to his wingman, his voice crackling through the static. "They're everywhere, but they're slow. Stay on your targets, boys. This is our day." And it was. By noon, roughly 30 Zeros had been shot down while only 4 Hellcats were lost. The mathematics of air combat were brutally simple. For every American plane lost, Japan lost 7 or 8. The skies over Truk, which had once been Japan's domain, now belonged to the United States Navy. Here's the second lesson. Overconfidence is a silent killer in war. Japan's leaders believed Truk's natural defenses and distance from American bases made it safe. They were wrong. Technology, intelligence, and audacity can collapse any fortress, no matter how strong it looks on a map. The Americans proved that a well-planned strike, executed with overwhelming force and the element of surprise, can destroy in hours what took years to build. With the skies firmly under their control, the Americans turned their firepower on the ground. Waves of F-6F Hellcats strafed the airfields, their machine guns stitching lines of bullet holes across runways and hangars. SBD Dauntless dive bombers screamed down from the sky, releasing their bombs at the last possible second before pulling up in steep climbs. TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, heavy and slow but deadly accurate, pounded fuel depots, radar stations, and anti-aircraft positions. Within hours, the airfield on Eaton Island was a burning wreck. The seaplane base on Moen was engulfed in flames. Key installations across the lagoon were reduced to rubble. More than 40 Japanese aircraft were destroyed on the ground, blown apart before their engines could even be started. In later reconnaissance reports, US pilots noted that they encountered strong resistance only in the morning. By the afternoon, there were virtually no Japanese planes left to challenge them. The sky was empty except for American aircraft, circling like vultures over a dying animal. Throughout February 17th, American pilots carried out more than 30 bombing runs against Japanese shipping clustered in Truk's harbors. Squadron after squadron of SBD Dauntless dive bombers and TBF Avenger torpedo planes rained bombs and torpedoes on the ships below. By nightfall, a staggering 369 1,000-pound bombs, 498 550-pound bombs, and 70 torpedoes had been dropped. Without warning and with no fighter cover remaining, Japanese crews could do little but rely on anti-aircraft fire from nearby islands. But even that was sporadic, disorganized, desperate. Gunners fired into the sky, hoping to hit something, anything. But the American planes kept coming, wave after wave, relentless as the tide. Across the lagoon, chaos reigned. Transport ships, supply vessels, and small warships were hit one after another, exploding, breaking apart, sinking into what had once been a tropical paradise. Black smoke rose in thick columns, blotting out the afternoon sun. The water, once crystal blue and so clear you could see fish swimming below, turned dark with oil and debris. Bodies floated among the wreckage. The smell of burning fuel, cordite, and death hung heavy in the humid air. Amid this storm of bombs and fire, individual tragedies unfolded, stories of heroism, sacrifice, and the brutal reality of naval warfare. Ships of steel, men of flesh, the sinkings. Near the anchorage by Dublon Island, the oil tanker Hoyomaru sat low in the water, her holds filled with thousands of gallons of fuel destined for Japanese bases further south. She was a lifeline, a floating gas station for the war machine. She never delivered that cargo. Lieutenant Commander James D. Ramage, leader of Bombing Squadron 10 from the carrier USS Enterprise, dove steeply through scattered clouds, his dive bomber screaming toward the tanker below. The wind howled past his cockpit. His hands gripped the controls, steady despite the anti-aircraft fire bursting around him like fireworks. At just the right moment, timing honed by hours of training and combat experience, Ramage released his bombs. The impact struck Hoyomaru amidships, and within seconds, the ship erupted in a massive fireball that lit up the morning sky. Flames shot hundreds of feet into the air as thousands of gallons of aviation fuel ignited at once, the explosion so powerful it could be felt on islands miles away. The heat was so intense that sailors on nearby ships turned their faces away, shielding their eyes from the blinding light. A sailor on a nearby transport ship, watching the explosion with wide eyes, might have grabbed his friend's arm and whispered, his voice trembling, "We're next. There's nowhere to run." And he was right. The attacks kept coming. Elsewhere in the lagoon, the ammunition ship Ikokumaru was a floating powder keg. Her holds were packed with explosives, artillery shells, and munitions meant to resupply Japanese forces across the Pacific. Every sailor aboard knew they were sitting on top of enough firepower to level a city. One direct hit would be catastrophic. And that's exactly what happened. Captain James E. Bridges of Torpedo Squadron 6 aboard the USS Intrepid heroically guided his TBF Avenger torpedo bomber straight toward the Ikokumaru. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky around him, tracers slicing through the air like deadly fireflies. Flak bursts exploded in black puffs, rocking his plane. Bridges held his course, his jaw set, his hands steady on the controls. He was a veteran pilot, a man who had seen combat before, but this run was different. This one felt final. He released his bomb, and it pierced the ship's magazine. The explosion was cataclysmic. Aikokumaru literally disappeared in a blinding flash of white-hot fire, the blast so violent it obliterated the ship in seconds. The shockwave rippled across the lagoon, shattering windows on nearby islands and knocking men off their feet. A mushroom cloud rose into the sky, towering over the lagoon like a miniature atomic bomb. Bridges' plane, too close to escape, was engulfed by the fireball. He and his entire crew were killed instantly, a sacrifice that took hundreds of Japanese soldiers and engineers down with the ship. Another American pilot, watching from a safe distance as the smoke climbed into the heavens, might have keyed his radio with a shaking hand and said quietly, his voice barely audible over the static, "Jesus Christ, Aikoku's gone. Bridges didn't make it out." There was silence on the radio for a moment. Then someone replied, "He knew. He must have known." War asks the ultimate price from some, and Captain James E. Bridges paid it. His courage reminds us that behind every statistic, every ship sunk or aircraft lost, are real people who made split-second decisions between duty and survival. Sometimes they chose duty, knowing full well what it would cost them. We owe them more than numbers on a page. We owe them memory. The destroyer Fumizuki was struck midship by a torpedo early in the attack. The explosion tore a gaping hole in her hull, and water rushed in, flooding compartments below the waterline. Her crew fought through the night to save her, pumping water with hand-operated equipment when the electric pumps failed, shoring up bulkheads with wooden beams, desperately trying to keep the ship afloat. Officers shouted orders. Sailors worked in waist-deep water, their hands raw and bleeding from the effort. But by dawn on February 18th, flooding overwhelmed the vessel. The forward section dipped lower and lower into the water. Men began climbing onto the deck, preparing to abandon ship. And then, with a groan of tortured steel, Fumizuki slipped beneath the waves, taking with her the exhausted men who had fought to the very end, who had believed, right up until the moment the water closed over them, that they could save her. The destroyer Tachikaze had already run aground on a coral reef in early February, and was effectively out of action, a wounded animal unable to flee. American bombs rained down on her anyway, and a torpedo hit her engine room, finishing what the reef had started. She sank stern first in a raging inferno, flames climbing her masts, a funeral pyre for a ship that never had a chance to fight back. Another destroyer, Oiti, was struck by a torpedo and snapped in two like a twig. One moment she was a functioning warship, her crew at their posts, her engines humming. The next moment she was breaking apart, the two halves of her hull tilting in opposite directions. She sank almost instantly, taking more than 170 men down with her. There was no time to abandon ship, no time for final words, just the cold, dark water of the Pacific closing over steel and flesh alike. As for the famed lucky ship Shiga, a veteran survivor of many battles who seemed to have a guardian angel watching over her, this time her luck nearly ran out. A bomb hit her No. 2 gun turret, the explosion killing 21 sailors instantly and wounding 45 more. The survivors, covered in blood and soot, dragged their wounded comrades below deck and fought fires that threatened to consume the ship. Badly damaged but still afloat, Shiga managed to limp back to Japan, one of the few warships to escape the slaughter at Truk. Her crew would live to fight another day, but they would never forget the friends they left behind in the lagoon. By midday on February 17th, Japan's air defenses were virtually wiped out. American planes roamed freely in small groups, hunting down any vessels still trying to flee. It was no longer a battle. It was a hunt, and the prey had nowhere to hide. The light cruiser Naka, flagship of Japan's 4th Cruiser Division, attempted to escape westward amid the chaos, pushing her engines to the limit, black smoke pouring from her stacks as her crew shoveled coal into the boilers as fast as they could. Her captain, standing on the bridge with binoculars pressed to his eyes, might have scanned the horizon and thought, "If we can just reach open water, if we can just get beyond the range of their carriers, we might survive this." But at 2 p.m. she was spotted 35 nautical miles west of Truk by aircraft from the carriers Bunker Hill and Cowpens, Task Group 58.3. A formation of SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers and TBF Avenger torpedo planes swooped in for the kill, their pilots communicating tersely over the radio, coordinating their attack with practiced efficiency. Bombs fell. Torpedoes splashed into the water, leaving trails of bubbles as they raced toward their target. Within minutes, Naka took at least one bomb and one torpedo hit. The cruiser shuddered, her hull rupturing under the force of the explosions. She broke into and sank beneath the waves, taking 240 officers and sailors down with her. Her commander, Rear Admiral Ichimaru, was thrown overboard by the blast, plunging into the oil-slicked water. He survived, clinging to debris until a nearby Japanese destroyer pulled him from the sea hours later, one of the few to live and tell the story of Naka's final moments. But the slaughter was not over. Admiral Raymond Spruance, standing on the bridge of his flagship, wanted one more victory, a surface battle, the old-fashioned way, with guns and steel and fire. He wanted to prove that even in an age of aircraft carriers, battleships still had teeth. When battleships speak, the surface action. Late in the afternoon of February 17th, Admiral Spruance detached a special surface action group, codenamed Task Group 50.9, composed of the battleships Iowa and New Jersey, the heavy cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans, and 4 destroyer escorts. Their mission: enter Truk Lagoon and hunt down any Japanese ships still afloat. Spruance wanted a surface battle, a test of guns and steel, the way naval warfare had been fought for centuries before aircraft carriers changed everything. At the entrance to the lagoon, Task Group 50.9 encountered a small Japanese formation attempting to flee into the open ocean. It consisted of the light cruiser Katori, flagship of Rear Admiral Masami Kobayashi, the auxiliary ship Akagi Maru, the destroyers Maikaze and Nowaki, and the escort minesweeper Shonan Maru No. 15. This group had departed Truk just before the American raid began, slipping out of the lagoon under cover of early morning darkness, hoping to escape before the storm arrived. But they were relentlessly pursued by carrier-based aircraft throughout the day. The Akagi Maru had been hit by 3 bombs, erupting into a blazing inferno that forced her crew to abandon ship, leaping into the water as flames consumed the vessel. Now the survivors of the small flotilla were limping westward, their hulls damaged, their crews exhausted, hoping against hope that they could escape into the vast emptiness of the Pacific. Upon hearing of the fleeing squadron, Spruance was eager to engage in direct surface combat. He ordered Admiral Mark Mitcher to cease all airstrikes against the escaping ships, insisting that Task Group 50.9 would handle it the traditional way, with naval gunfire, the way wars at sea had been fought for generations. Standing on the bridge of his flagship New Jersey, his hands clasped behind his back, Admiral Spruance personally directed the final battle of the day. The engagement would be short, brutal, and utterly one-sided. The Katori, already holed and on fire after taking 7 bombs and a torpedo from earlier air attacks, still fought back with her remaining guns until the very end. Her crew knew there was no escape, but they refused to surrender. Gunners loaded shells and fired, their hands blistered and burned, sweat pouring down their faces in the tropical heat. Officers shouted orders, their voices hoarse from smoke and exhaustion. They fought because that's what sailors do. They fight until the ship sinks or the enemy does. The American warships closed in for the kill. The battleship Iowa, her massive turrets swiveling with mechanical precision, unleashed a devastating barrage. 46 rounds from her massive 16-inch, 406mm guns, each shell weighing over a ton, and 124 rounds from her 5-inch, 127mm batteries, the smaller guns firing so fast they sounded like continuous thunder. The shells tore into Katori's hull, ripping through steel plating like paper, detonating inside her compartments, blowing men and machinery apart. Simultaneously, the cruisers Minneapolis and New Orleans, along with the destroyers Bradford and Burns, fired additional salvos and torpedoes, their guns adding to the cacophony of destruction. The water around Katori churned with shell splashes, geysers of white foam shooting into the air. Around 5 p.m., Katori capsized and sank, her hull rolling over slowly, almost gracefully, before disappearing beneath the waves. Rear Admiral Masami Kobayashi went down with his ship, a captain's final duty, standing on the bridge as the water rose around him, choosing to die with his men rather than live in defeat. Elsewhere in the chaotic engagement, the destroyer Maikaze launched a desperate torpedo, spread toward the battleship New Jersey, the crew working frantically to aim and fire their weapons in a last-ditch attempt to strike back. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, Spruance's flagship was forced to make an emergency turn to evade the deadly torpedoes racing through the water, their wakes visible as they passed just yards away from the battleship's hull. Iowa immediately retaliated with heavy gunfire, her guns tracking Maikaze with cold precision. The American destroyers charged forward in pursuit, their bows cutting through the waves, closing the distance. Maikaze was hit repeatedly, shells punching through her thin armor, explosions ripping through her engine room and bridge. She exploded in a ball of fire and sank within minutes, taking her entire crew down with her. There were no survivors. Not one. The escort vessel Shonan Maru No. 15 met the same fate, blown apart by cruiser fire and sinking in flames, her crew's final moments lost to the chaos of battle. Only the destroyer Nowaki managed to escape into the night, her captain using the cover of darkness and desperate maneuvering to slip through the American cordon. Smoke screens, evasive turns, sheer luck. Somehow, Nowaki made it to safety, becoming the sole survivor of the Japanese flotilla. Her crew would live to tell the story, though they would carry the memory of their lost comrades for the rest of their lives. The fourth lesson: courage without support is not enough. The Katori and Maikaze fought bravely, their crews refusing to give up even when all hope was lost. But they were outgunned, outnumbered, and alone. War rewards not just bravery, but also preparation, intelligence, and overwhelming force. Japan had none of these at Truk. Bravery matters, it matters deeply, but in the cold mathematics of war, it's not always enough to change the outcome. As dusk fell on February 17th, the sky turning orange and purple over the smoking ruins of Truk Lagoon, the Japanese had one last card to play: a desperate night counterattack. One torpedo in the darkness, the only American loss. Under the cover of night, the Japanese sent out a last wave of B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, almost a suicide mission, hoping to strike back. From sunset to about 10 p.m., small teams of 2 or 3 aircraft skimmed the waves, trying to slip through American fighter patrols and the fleet's anti-aircraft screen. In the darkness, their engines were little more than a low hum, their pilots steering by moonlight and instinct, praying they could find the carriers before anyone found them. Most never got close. Radar-directed night fighters hunted them down, and the moment a silhouette showed against the stars, American gunners filled the sky with tracers. One by one, the attackers vanished into the black, leaving scattered flames on the water where wreckage burned and oil fires flickered like candles in a storm. But one aircraft broke through. At 10:11 p.m., the night exploded. A torpedo slammed into USS Intrepid, CV-11, tearing into her side with a shock that threw men off their feet. One of her propeller shafts was wrecked. Fire climbed from the wound in her hull as water poured into compartments below. Damage control parties rushed in, working blind in smoke and heat, choking in narrow passageways, hands raw on hoses and valves, fighting to stop the flooding before the sea could claim the ship. 11 sailors died in the blast, some lost so completely the ocean never returned them. Others were carried to the medical bay, where doctors worked under emergency lights, stitching, bandaging, and cutting away burned clothing while the ship shuddered and groaned around them. The hit forced Admiral Raymond Spruance to pull Intrepid out of formation. She would limp back for repairs, first to Pearl Harbor, then onward to San Francisco for a major overhaul, taking months before she returned to combat. And that is the point, because in a battle that looked almost effortless on paper, the enemy still found a way to draw blood. One pilot, one torpedo, one moment of luck and determination. Against Japan's catastrophic losses, it was a small result strategically, but to the men on Intrepid, it was everything. War does not care that you are winning, it only needs a single opening. You can almost hear a sailor carrying a wounded friend below deck, blood slick on his hands, muttering through clenched teeth. One damn plane, out of all of them. One got through. That's all it takes. Fifth lesson. Even in the most one-sided fight, the enemy can still hurt you. Overconfidence doesn't only doom the losing side, it can cost the victors too. Dominance is not immunity. The right response to victory is not relaxation, but sharper discipline, vigilance, respect for desperation, and the hard humility of knowing that luck can turn on a single second. And Mitcher understood that danger better than anyone. He wasn't willing to give the Japanese even one night to breathe, so he took a step no carrier commander had dared to take before, a decision that would rewrite the rules of naval warfare. Night strike, a historical first. Just after midnight on February 18, 1944, the U.S. Navy launched its first-ever night air attack in history. 12 TBF-1C Avenger bombers from Squadron VT-10 aboard the USS Enterprise, each carrying 4 250-kilogram bombs, silently flew toward Truk under starlit skies. The moon hung low on the horizon, casting silver light across the water. The pilots, flying by instruments and sheer courage, navigated through the darkness toward the burning lagoon ahead. Flying at night, over water, with no margin for error, was dangerous enough in daylight. At night, it was nearly suicidal. One mistake in altitude, one misjudged turn, and the plane would crash into the ocean, disappearing without a trace. But these were experienced pilots, veterans of months of combat, and they flew with a confidence born of skill and determination. Throughout the night, they took turns pounding the remaining Japanese ships, flying by moonlight, navigating by the fires still burning on the islands below. The American pilots dove through the darkness, released their bombs, and pulled up just in time to avoid crashing into the water. In total, the squadron carried out 25 attack runs, scoring 13 direct hits and igniting 7 massive fires among anchored vessels. Explosions echoed through the night as columns of flame lit up the horizon over Truk Lagoon, the fires so bright they could be seen from miles away, signaling the inevitable destruction of Japan's remaining fleet. One pilot, circling back to the carrier after his bombing run, his hands trembling slightly from adrenaline, might have said over the radio, his voice filled with a mix of exhaustion and awe, "I can see the fires from 50 miles away. Trucks burning like hell itself." This night strike was more than just another attack. It was a turning point in naval aviation. Before Operation Hailstone, carrier-based night operations were considered too dangerous, too difficult, the risks too great for the potential rewards. Admiral Mitcher proved it could be done, and it would become standard practice in the years to come, a new weapon in the arsenal of modern warfare. When dawn broke on February 18th, the Americans were ready to finish what they had started. The final day, when the smoke cleared, at dawn on February 18, 1944, Operation Hailstone entered its final phase. From Enterprise, Yorktown, Essex, and Bunker Hill, American aircraft launched one more massive strike on Truk, and found the defenses already broken. No fighters rose to meet them. Anti-aircraft fire was nearly silent. U.S. planes moved almost at will, burning what remained. Fuel depots, ammunition dumps, hangars, and supply bases on Dublon and Eton. Thick black smoke climbed into the sky and dimmed the sun. Truk Lagoon, once turquoise and calm, had become a wreck-strewn graveyard of half-sunk ships, oil slicks, and floating debris, with the harsh smell of fire and death hanging in the humid air. After 36 hours of relentless attacks, Admiral Spruance concluded by the afternoon that all strategic objectives had been achieved. Truk was no longer a usable naval base. Airfields were cratered, fuel storage destroyed, and surviving ships scattered or fleeing. He ordered the operation terminated, and Task Force 58 regrouped and withdrew before nightfall, leaving behind a fortress reduced to ruins. The Reckoning. Counting the cost. The numbers tell a story of devastation so complete it's hard to comprehend. Japan lost 250 to 275 aircraft, destroyed in the air or on the ground, blown apart before they could even take off. More than 75% of supply depots were obliterated. Thousands of tons of food, ammunition, and equipment reduced to ashes. 17,000 tons of fuel, nearly all the reserves at Truk, burned in fires that could be seen from space if satellites had existed then. Nearly 200,000 tons of cargo, the lifeblood of Japan's Pacific War effort, sank to the bottom of the lagoon, never to be recovered. At sea, Japan's losses were even more devastating. 2 light cruisers, Naka and Katori, sent to the bottom with hundreds of men. 4 destroyers, Fumizuki, Maikaze, Oite, and Tachikaze, broken and sunk. More than 40 transport, tanker, and auxiliary ships, the unglamorous workhorses that kept armies fed and fleets fueled, destroyed in a single day. This amounted to nearly 1/10 of all Japanese merchant shipping losses during an 8-month period, lost in just 36 hours. The logistical backbone of Japan's Pacific War effort, already strained to the breaking point, had been shattered beyond repair. By contrast, the U.S. suffered minimal losses. 25 aircraft downed out of 1,250 sorties flown, a loss rate of less than 2%. 40 personnel killed, each one a tragedy to their families, but a remarkably low number given the scale of the operation. No warships sunk, only USS Intrepid heavily damaged. The exchange ratio was staggering. For every American aircraft lost, Japan lost more than 10. For every American sailor killed, dozens of Japanese soldiers, sailors, and civilian workers died. The battle was not a contest. It was a massacre, a demonstration of overwhelming technological and tactical superiority. After the battle, the U.S. Navy launched rescue missions for downed pilots, sending seaplanes and destroyers into dangerous waters to bring their men home. The most remarkable story was that of Lieutenant George M. Blair from VF-9 USS Essex, who was shot down over enemy-held waters in broad daylight, his plane hit by anti-aircraft fire, trailing smoke as it spiraled down into the lagoon. Lieutenant Denver F. Baxter, piloting a Kingfisher seaplane, received the call for help, and made a decision that would earn him a place in naval aviation legend. He landed his seaplane in enemy waters, under fire from Japanese positions on the islands, the bullets snapping through the air around him, splashing into the water. Blair, treading water and exhausted, swam to the plane and clung to the aircraft's wing as Baxter revved the engine and took off, the extra weight making the seaplane sluggish and slow. 9 Hellcats circled overhead, strafing the Japanese positions to keep them suppressed, providing cover for the daring rescue. When they landed safely back on the carrier, Blair, shivering and exhausted but alive, might have looked at Baxter with gratitude beyond words and said, his voice breaking, "You didn't have to come back for me. You could have been killed." And Baxter, with a tired smile, his flight suit soaked with sweat and seawater, might have simply replied, "That's what we do. No one gets left behind." The daring rescue earned Baxter the Distinguished Flying Cross and became a symbol of courage and brotherhood amid the inferno of Truk. It reminds us that even in the midst of overwhelming destruction, humanity endures. War brings out the worst in us, the killing, the burning, the dying. But it also brings out moments of extraordinary courage and loyalty. Baxter risked his life to save Blair because that's what brothers in arms do. We should never forget that even in war, people still choose to be heroes. Aftermath. The fortress that became a grave. For Japan, Truk Lagoon would never again be the impregnable fortress. The US Navy's sudden blow shocked Tokyo and shattered the base's purpose overnight. With its airfields wrecked and its fuel and stores destroyed, Truk became a hollow shell, too crippled to serve as a forward stronghold. Allied air and sea power sealed it off. Cut from resupply, the Japanese garrison slipped into slow collapse, hunger, sickness, and exhaustion replacing discipline and confidence. Men planted small gardens in scraps of soil and fished the lagoon for anything they could find, sometimes hauling up twisted metal instead of food. They waited for help that never came, isolated by a war that had already moved on. On March 12, 1944, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz made the decision that confirmed Truk's fate. He cancelled plans to invade. If the fortress could be neutralized from a distance, there was no reason to spend American lives taking ground that was already a graveyard. Japan's Fang had been pulled without a single amphibious landing. Truk became a lesson written in smoke. Why storm heavily fortified islands when you could bypass them, isolate them, and let them wither? The old idea of fixed defenses, reefs, guns, and concrete could be made obsolete in hours by carriers, mobility, and striking power. From there, American focus shifted to the Marianas, Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, stepping stones close enough to bring the new B-29 bombers within reach of Japan itself. Truk, once central, slipped into irrelevance. Today, the lagoon's wrecks still lie beneath clear water like a frozen moment of defeat, an underwater graveyard turned museum. And you can imagine, years later, an aging Japanese officer standing on the shore, staring out at the calm blue surface and hearing, in memory, the fire and the screams. Perhaps he would whisper to no one at all, "We thought Truk was untouchable. We thought distance and coral would save us." But they came anyway, and in 2 days they erased everything. That was when I knew we could not win. Lessons from the depths. What Operation Hailstone teaches us. Let me tell you what Operation Hailstone really means, beyond the numbers, beyond the tactics, beyond the list of ships that went down. First lesson: half measures are worse than doing nothing. Japan pulled out its most valuable ships, but it left Truk looking like a stronghold, still stacked with fuel, supplies, and equipment, without the power to protect any of it. That in-between choice didn't save Truk. It painted a target on it. In war, in business, even in personal life, a position is either worth defending properly, or it's worth leaving. Anything in the middle invites a disaster you can't control. Second lesson: overconfidence kills quietly. Japan trusted nature, reefs, distance, the myth of an impregnable lagoon. But intelligence, technology, and bold timing turned that confidence into ashes in about 36 hours. The danger isn't only an enemy's strength. It's the moment you start believing you don't have to worry anymore. Yesterday's fortress can become tomorrow's tomb faster than anyone wants to admit. Third lesson: war takes its payment in human lives, not statistics. Captain James E. Bridges didn't die as a number. He died as a decision, made in seconds under pressure most people will never understand. When people say ships sunk or aircraft destroyed, it sounds clean. But behind every line in a report is someone's son, brother, friend. Memory is not decoration. It is a duty. Gratitude is not sentiment. It is responsibility. Fourth lesson. Courage without support is not enough. The crews of Katori and Maikaze fought with the kind of stubborn bravery that deserves respect. But bravery can't replace air cover. It can't replace radar. It can't replace fuel, numbers, and coordination. War doesn't only reward courage, it rewards systems. We honor the courage, but we also have to learn the harder truth. Sometimes the brave are defeated simply because they are alone. Fifth lesson. Even in victory, the enemy can still hurt you. One torpedo bomber damaged USS Intrepid and reminded everyone of a brutal fact. There is no safe moment in war. Winning can tempt you into carelessness. The enemy's desperation is dangerous precisely because it has nothing left to lose. Vigilance isn't paranoia, it's survival. Sixth lesson. Humanity can survive inside the worst machinery ever built. Lieutenant Denver F. Baxter landing in enemy waters to save another man. This is the kind of act that punches through the darkness. War is built to reduce people into targets and numbers, but people still refuse. They still choose loyalty. They still choose to risk themselves for someone else. That is the part of war that hurts to remember, and the part that keeps us from becoming cold. Seventh lesson. Modern war can erase old fortresses overnight. Truk didn't fall to a costly amphibious invasion. It was neutralized from the horizon by carriers and aircraft. That was the future announcing itself. And the warning reaches far beyond 1944. If you cling to outdated assumptions because that's how it's always been, you don't just lose, you get erased. Adapt or break. Learn or disappear. So yes, Operation Hailstone teaches strategy, intelligence, preparation, mobility, adaptation. It teaches that static defenses and comforting geography are illusions in a world that moves faster every year. But it also teaches something heavier. War is not a chess game played by clean hands. It is grief measured in silence. Families who waited for letters that never came. Children who grew up without fathers. Wives who became widows before they had time to understand what the word even meant. And yet, inside that tragedy, people still do things that are unmistakably human. Bridges flying into fire. Baxter landing into danger. Sailors fighting on when the outcome is already written. These moments don't make war beautiful. Nothing makes war beautiful. But they remind us that even when the world is at its worst, human beings can still choose something noble. That may be the deepest meaning of Hailstone. Power can destroy a fortress in 2 days, but character is revealed in a single moment. The ghosts of Truk still speak. Today, Truk Lagoon is quiet. The turquoise waters have reclaimed the wreckage. Divers explore the sunken ships, swimming through rusted corridors where sailors once walked, peering into empty gun turrets where men once stood ready to fight. Coral grows on the hulls, transforming machines of war into reefs teeming with life. Fish swim through broken windows, darting in and out of the shadows. The lagoon has become a graveyard turned into a monument, a place where the past whispers to those willing to listen. Operation Hailstone was worse than most people think, not just because of the scale of destruction, not just because Japan lost nearly 1/10 of its merchant fleet in 36 hours, not just because a fortress once compared to Pearl Harbor fell so quickly it shocked the world. It was worse because of what it represents. It shows how quickly confidence can turn to disaster, how technology can reshape warfare overnight, how the cost of war is always, always paid in human lives. It shows that walls don't protect you if the enemy can fly over them. That distance means nothing if the enemy can reach you anyway. That no fortress is truly impregnable if your enemy is determined enough, smart enough, and willing to pay the price. The ghosts of Truk still speak. They tell us to learn from their mistakes, to honor their sacrifices, and to remember that the lessons of history are written in blood and steel. If we forget them, we risk repeating them. If we ignore them, we disrespect the memory of those who died learning them the hard way. And that, more than any statistic or tactical analysis, is why Operation Hailstone matters, not just as a chapter in World War II, but as a warning and a lesson for all of us, echoing across the decades from the depths of a forgotten lagoon where ships still lie in the darkness, silent sentinels of a war that changed the world forever.